Hello everyone, and welcome to the next installation of Wrestling with RahXephon. Now, this was originally going to be part of the tertiary cast video, however, while working on that, I sort of went on a tangent about why the motivations of this series and a lot of the writing pertaining to them make very little sense, and how that kind of weakens the series as a whole. And as such, that tangent didn't really feel relevant to the video, so it's going to become its own thing, and that's why we're here. Motivations are a very important part of any story because they explain why people or groups do what they do. And if we don't know why people or groups do what they do, it kind of either feels pointless or unnecessary, or we're just confused because we don't really understand what's happening or why it's happening. And a lot of stories can often manipulate how these are portrayed in order to either drum up suspense or get the viewer behind the production or many other things. In RahXephon's case, I think what they want to do is conceal motivations in order to get us to buy in more and just give the series a general sense of mystery. However, they conceal too much, and to be honest, I don't think some of it was thought out at all, i.e. it's not explained at all. There's not any confusing dialogue or anything like that. There's just no dialogue. And for this reason, a lot of the series, or at least the motivations, feel incomplete, and this gives rise to both issues relating to the story or understanding it, as well as some logic and plot holes, and it weakens the series greatly, as at the end of the day it makes the viewer question, why do I care about these things? Why do these characters care about these things? And these are questions you never want a viewer to ask, especially if you don't provide a readily available answer. The motivations also make the ending of the series a little more confusing and morally ambiguous, as since everyone ends up working towards the same goal, basically everyone gets what they want. However, if one side is a protagonist and the other side is the antagonist, their goals probably wouldn't line up most of the time. Even in a movie or series where two groups compete for the same thing, say both groups need to find the 4 elemental crystals, the motivations for doing the same task are usually different, i.e. the good guys probably want to protect them and the bad guys probably want to use them to control the world or something. Even if they're working towards a common procedure or task in this case, the end goal or purpose of that task is still very different, and this still establishes conflicting motivations. However, in RahXephon, these conflicting motivations are never really set up, and everything's just kind of a morally ambiguous blob when we really zoom out. And we can really see this by asking some questions that are raised by examining the motivations and actions of the 3 main factions of this series. Those being Terra, the Foundation, and the Mu. Which, although all seemingly opposed, don't actually do anything all that different. All of them rely on the singular strategy of manipulating a young man to basically carry out their bidding. And now they go about this differently, but at the end of the day, they're all just controlling one man to do all the work for them, and it just so happens that what they want him to do all happens to be the same thing. In this way, they're all kind of bad, because Ayato's a pawn in this scenario, and he doesn't really have any agency here. He does go out of his way to try and establish some, but the series backtracks on that later, and even backtracks on his character writing, which we'll get into, and this does create a lot of problems when looking at the series philosophically. Now, quick disclaimer before we get into things. This video will be what I consider a relatively objective one, centering on what I find to be several writing issues that RahXephon has as a series, and therefore it may sound a little harsh. That's not to say I hate or even dislike RahXephon. In fact, I find it extremely interesting, albeit not for the reasons that were probably intended. However, I don't hate the show. I just think that when analyzing anything, it's important to remain objective in order to view both the good of a series and the bad of a series. If this is your favorite anime, I have no intention of telling you you're dumb for that. I understand that everyone has their own tastes, and I myself find it interesting. Also, I want to establish that I do understand that RahXephon does a lot of indirect storytelling, and that there is some lore established here. While I will speak about why the motivations and actions present don't make sense to me in context, I do understand that there is some context given. Well, I am aware of the fact that Maya and Quan are sisters, and they both came out of the ruins in their Ikanai, and Maya woke up first, and Quan was sleeping the whole time, and for some reason was entrusted to the Baben Foundation to be cared for. I'm also aware of the fact that Ayato and Itsuki are of Quan's DNA, and that Maya seemed to either initiate or at least tacitly approve of the process that led to this. Somehow the Foundation may or may not be involved in this as well, and I also understand that. And I do understand other smaller details, like the fact that Itsuki is a failed instrumentalist, and that they had to wait for Quan to awaken to initiate this plan. And there is other things like that that I'm aware of. I'm not here to debate the context here. What I'm here to debate is, why do the characters try to reach the goals they do within the context? For example, I understand that Ayato was created either by the Mu or the Foundation to be an instrumentalist to retune the world. I understand that part. What I'm getting at is below that. What I'm getting at is the why. I don't understand why they do what they do, other than very vague reasons provided by the series, i.e. they want to retune the world. But why do they want to retune the world? And this deeper questioning and how motivations that aren't defined somehow end up conflicting more than they should or aligning more than they should is really going to be the point of this video. I want to ask how these factions came to the conclusion that their goals are the ones that they need to pursue, and how for some reason this means that they all end up pursuing the same goal. Let's look at the Foundation and the Mu in order to see why Ayato's motivation doesn't work by establishing what the motivations he's supposed to oppose. Lord Baben, though, this guy, oh boy, he and his place in the entirety of the plot confused me to almost no end. In fact, the whole goal of the Foundation and the Mu and even Terra itself confused me to no end, and we can really start to see this in this part of the cast, as in terms of what they do physically, I understand. They're funding the UN, and Baben wants to make the instrumentalists play for him so that he can retune the world. I understand that that's the goal. However, I don't really understand the motivations here, or why he's written into the series at all. There's two misunderstandings here. I don't understand him in-universe, and I don't understand him from a production point of view. So in the series, Baben is just this shadowy old guy who heads the Baben Foundation, which kind of controls the UN and Terra by funding them. It seems like he's like a shadow governor kind of guy, and as such, he's untouchable. And he has a ton of money, and he uses all these resources that he's acquired over 10,000 years to try and retune the world. Why he wants to do this? Not really said. All that we know in series is that he created the RahXephon somehow, and he intends to use it somehow to retune the world for reasons. Why this has taken 10,000 years, I don't know. The series doesn't really know either. It doesn't really explain why he wants to retune everything. I think on Wikipedia it said something about he wants to undo a past mistake of sinking the continent of Mu. However, I don't know where they got that from, and I don't think that's actually in the series. I think that's from some supplemental material that fleshes this stuff out on its own. So as far as we know, just from the series, i.e. the main source material, Baben wants to retune the world for no specific reason. But, you know, I'm okay with that. He's crazy. He's some eldritch force beyond our comprehension. Sure, whatever. He's pulling the strings, and even he doesn't really know what's going on. Sure, whatever. Whatever. I guess I could give that a pass. That's poor writing, but I've seen worse, and that would be competent. But for some of the reasons that we're going to get into, that isn't adequate here. As like the trope of an eldritch's motivations being incomprehensible to humanity, the writing here is also kind of incomprehensible to me, as what I don't get is, if Baben could make the RahXephon, why did he go so long to wait for the tuning? And there's no real reason for this being given. It doesn't say when he made the RahXephon, it just says that he made it. But he's pretty old and it seems to have been in storage for a while, so I assume it's been done for a while. Does he just need like the right guy? It took him 10,000 years to gaslight a teenager into doing this? Also, it's stated that Baben is the first of the Mu, but he seems to be actively disliked by the other Mu faction, the main Mu faction led by Maya that we'll get into later. But that's not really explained either. So what we're left with is this eldritch force with all these time and resources and power, and seems to be aware of every other faction, yet took 10,000 years to execute this plan, which realistically, most of the work happened in like a week. Like, you have all this setup, but you're just gonna completely trust your unknowing underlings to do everything? Like, what is the big plan here? I mean, he's had this big foundation for decades, if not centuries by this point, and he has a well-established cloning program. He couldn't have cobbled together some kind of plan earlier? He also seems pretty hands-off, which doesn't really make sense to me, because I understand that as like the shadow government guy, he doesn't need to be like right there, but he seems to put a lot of faith in subordinates who are awful insubordinate. I'm looking at you, Makoto. Okay though, maybe Baben has the best guys, and maybe he can big brain Palpatine his way into getting others to do all the work for him. But even if that's the case, why does he actively oppose the other move? This question right here kind of single-handedly ruins the Foundation's entire existence to me. If not ruin, puts it in the question for me. And the series never even attempts to rectify it. Let's just zoom out. So we know that Baben is the first Mu. That's said by multiple characters. And we also know that he and Maya know of each other, and that they're both Mu. We also know this. We also see both of them go on record as saying that their goals are to retune the world, using the power of the RahXephon. So they share a goal. We also know that they don't like each other and actively oppose each other, as Baben funds Terra, which in turn fights the Mu. However, if they have the exact same goal, why do they fight? Even if he doesn't want to do anything, it seems like the Mu would just kind of accomplish his objective anything. Like, he would win by doing nothing in this case. The tuning would happen regardless, unless the Mu bungled it, but then he could just step in anyways. So even if he did nothing, like, he would still get what he wants. Is it just that he needed to orchestrate some kind of conflict to really force Ayato to grow into the instrumentalist? Like, this is something that had to happen in a high-pressure environment, that he needed a war in order to kind of forge his warrior, I guess? Even if that's the case, though, why would he fight the Mu? Or couldn't they, like, cobble together some easier scheme to follow? Why do they dislike each other? Because even if they wanted to cobble together a war, wouldn't they still be tacitly aware of each other? You know, kind of like, you know, Palpatine and Dooku or something. They'd still be on the same side. They would just pretend like they're not. But it seems like they're actively opposing each other in all facets here. I just don't get it. Like, you're telling me that Baben plotted for 10,000 years, resurrected himself numerous times, acquired near infinite resources, spent near infinite resources, and manipulated literally the entire world and fought off an entire alien interdimensional race just to reach the endgame of gaslighting a 17-year-old boy? Some objective the Mu would just kind of accomplish regardless. Like, what? It feels like the Mu are supposed to be the CIS to Baben's Republic, i.e., like I said, two forces that seem opposed but are really controlled by the same guy, created solely to create a proxy conflict in order to further one's power. But that's not really the case here, as, again, they actively oppose each other, and they seem to loathe each other even to some extent. There's no dialogue or even exposition explaining this, though, so why even have Baben reference them? Or why even have Baben at all? I mean, like, he gets what he wants at the end anyways, so was his presence even necessary? I understand they want a multifaceted story, but they're just shoving too many things in too many directions here. It seems to me like the Mu should have just been the bad guys, and the Foundation is just not needed at all. I don't get the point. It just doesn't make sense to have this tertiary faction, if that tertiary faction has the same goal as the main antagonist faction, and yet is not the main, like, good guy faction. I think they wanted to do something like Sele is in Evangelion, but it doesn't work because in that series, there's a lot of other smaller conspiracies going on. It's more of a bureaucratic mess, and the angels aren't really a faction so much as, like, wild creatures. I know they're intelligent, but it makes more sense in the writing perspective if you kind of think of them like that for this example. So why even have Baben? They really wanted some nefarious old guy to do some Sele-like stuff. Just have him be this random, unassuming old guy who kind of pops up out of nowhere and flips the table or something. Or have him be like Ayato's old man friend who teaches him the final technique. Or something that makes a bit more sense than them literally just going to Ayato and say, hey, you gotta do the thing. Which is, like, really weird and kind of forced. Or just let him be like an actual Palpatine actively controlling both sides. As it stands now, though, this guy's just kind of a weirdo whose non-explained motivations clash with his non-explained competition against the Mu, whom he, for no reason at all, seems to share a motivation with. He and the Foundation are critical to the lore of RahXephon and a lot of the stuff that happens, and yet are just completely superfluous to the entirety of the series and kind of just bloat everything. Which is kind of impressive. I understand that They wanted to create this tertiary faction to kind of add some tension into the series. We see this a lot early on where they're kind of portrayed as bad when they kidnap Quan and try to get her to awaken for some reason. But I don't know, are they the good guys or are they the bad guys? I can't tell. Speaking of bad guys though, finally that gets us to the Mew. And again, their motivations are pretty murky as well, as from what I can tell, they flip-flop between the goal of conquering the world and the goal of retuning it, which, as we see in the series, are completely mutually exclusive, or at least as it was here. As mentioned earlier, the Mew also seem to know of the Baben Foundation and be opposed to it, even though they share the same motivation, both of these things for no reason, and they do have a similar plan using the same pieces. My personal theory here is that there is probably some kind of inner faction divide where Maya wants to retune the world, but a lot of the lower Mew or the military side simply want to conquer it. And we kind of see a little microscopic sliver of this, as Maya does seem to be opposed to a Terra guy who seems to just be a full militant and wants to conquer everything. But aside from a few lines, that's really all we get. And as far as I can tell, it's not really explained why the Mew have the goal they do and why they flip-flop between the two. The conquering part just makes sense. You take the resources, you conquer the land because you're the big bad empire. That's fine with me. I don't understand the retuning part. Although, again, maybe that's just a Maya goal or maybe just a Quan goal. On the Maya, motivations, not really explained. Personality, kind of vague and boring. Goals, not really explained. I mean, we know she wants to retune the world for some reason. That's kind of her motivation and her goal. But that's about all we get. And this is pretty weak considering how, on paper, important she is to the show. We don't even really know her main goal, really. She wants to retune the world, but depending on what episode you're in, her goal might be to conquer the world, or to liberate the Mew, or to retune it, or to prove that Mew and humans are the same, or I don't really know, and to be honest, at some point I just stopped caring, as all of this is just kind of overwhelming, and none of it's cemented. It all kind of just falls flat when we look at her and realize that, oh, she's just a cold, calculating, administrative type who, I guess she's doing stuff. Good for her. And there could have been some complex writing present. But her absence in the middle of the series really hinders this. I mean, she's just kind of a boring administrator at the end of the day. And the fact that the series never cuts to her or Mew HQ before episode 18 is objectively bad. It really limits her screen time. I kind of forgot she was in the show even, because there is a big gap where she just doesn't show up. It's like if Ergo Proxy only had Rawl in the first 5 episodes and the last 5 episodes, and then wanted us to accept him as the nuanced and developed character he is, even though we have no idea what he was doing in that middle period. We didn't have any of that time to get to know him either. All we would really get to know is who this person is, some of what they do, a fragment of their motivations, maybe a sliver of their personal motivations and personality. And what I'm saying here is that whatever Maya is and whatever her goals are, we really don't care to a certain extent because her character is just kind of flat. And RahXephon really misses a lot of opportunities here. As, again, it never cuts to Mew HQ for 15 episodes, so we have no idea how their plans are progressing or what their goals are, or perhaps even if they're sympathetic or not. As for some reason, it seems like the show wants us to sympathize with the Mew in the last 3 episodes. For some reason, I don't understand why, I don't, but it seems like they wanted to do a 180 at the last minute and kind of failed. I mean, by the time the Mew even come back, so many things and characters have been introduced, so many questions have been lingering and unanswered, that when they do come back and add to these questions, instead of actually starting to resolve stuff, we, or at least I, kind of just check out as an audience. These guys don't really answer any of the lore questions I would want them to, and instead just say more confusing things and backtrack on things that are supposed to have already been established. I think that they should have just had more concrete motivations, or at the very least have some interfaction showings so that we can kind of get to know them more. Instead, though, what we got is a lot of bloat and a lot of things that don't really make sense to me. So I don't really blame anyone who just kind of stopped caring when these guys were on the screen. Also, quick note, does anyone find it really weird how at the last episode they kind of want us to sympathize with Maya as she's trying to portray as Ayato's tragic mother? I really kind of hated this addition because it feels super forced and contrived. She tortures him, she gaslights him, she kind of says, "You're gonna get in the robot, Shinji." So it's very obvious that even if she does kind of love him in some way, her goal of retuning the world or whatever it is way more important to her than her actual son. So the idea that she's this loving mother who regrets everything at the last minute and that we should forgive her or feel bad for her is stupid to me. And I really hate that RahXephon tries to redeem everyone, it seems. Like, some people are just bad, and you need the bad guys to be bad. And really it's just bungled, as for some reason, now we're supposed to sympathize with war criminals who have killed literally millions of people for no real reason, or reason at least that we know of. Yeah, no, Maya's not getting my sympathy vote here. Anyways, as we can see, the Mu and the Foundation basically share the same goal. Even if they don't like each other and fight for some reason, they use the same pieces to accomplish this goal, which, by the way, aren't explained at all, so it just makes everything more confusing and morally ambiguous. And to really make all of this clear, let's go back to Terra's motivations. Now, as the good guys, Terra should be morally upstanding, or at least morally gray. They need to be at least relatively a lot better than the opposing factions in order to make it seem like they're the good guys, even if they are morally gray. This can work, and has worked in many cases. Bleach is a great example. Segotai 13 are actually very morally gray when we look at them like as a whole, but compared to everyone else in the series, they're very obviously the gooder guys, and so the protagonists. In addition, a lot of the characters in that series are likable and well fleshed out, but that's a different story. Anyways, on paper it seems like Terra doesn't share the same goal as the Foundation and the Mu, because Terra is set up as a preservation group. They're opposed to any kind of radical change in order to preserve the status quo of humanity, somehow attempting to defeat the Mu. So they're set up as a very bog standard alien fighting force, I guess, which is fine, that's fine. It doesn't need to be the most out of the box thing. That works fine. However, there's a lot of backsliding as the series progresses, and we see this mostly in Watari, the director, and Uncle Ricto, who, although they're supposed to be like the big brains of Terra, and in most stories would be set up as a kind of insubordinate opposition to the Foundation, i.e. guys that supposedly work for the antagonists, but manipulate and subvert orders from above in order to do the right thing, they don't. These two characters are extremely passive and just sit on their ass the whole time. So the Terra organization basically just ends up knowingly, it seems, carrying out the Foundation's orders, which, as we've established earlier, are the exact same as the Mu's. So, in a sense, Terra has the same motivation as the Mu. This could still work, however, if Ayato's motivations are drastically different, and thus distinguish him as a force for change in this narrative. But they don't, because he ends up completely backtracking in the past 5 episodes, and basically coming to the same conclusion that both the Mu and the Foundation do. To quickly summarize Ayato's motivation and why it doesn't work in this series, the entirety of his motivation and character development up until about episode 20 are that of the perseverer. He perseveres through adversity in order to preserve and protect those around him. He is set up as the noble hero who is trying to defy the odds and of getting everyone through this great crisis as intact as possible. In this way, he's kind of a conventional anime protagonist, but there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the trope of the guy who simply wants to protect those he loves. And we see this as he fights both the Mu in literal fights, and as he fights the Ixtli inside of him in a metaphorical or metaphysical sense. By fighting the Mu physically, he fights a physical struggle against physical forces that are destroying everything around him. By fighting the Ixtli and debating with it about the need of retuning and what the current state of the world is, he fights a philosophical battle promoting the idea of carrying on in spite of the circumstances that one may find themselves in. In this way, Ayato is set up to be a great protagonist who, even though he has moments of doubt, and even though he has to find himself by returning to Tokyo Jupiter briefly, promotes a solid narrative of persevering through things and managing to hold on and never giving up. However, for some reason, past about episode 24, this is all kind of thrown away, and instead he becomes like a big proponent of the retuning. Now, this is really weird because I don't see how this is a good idea at all. By doing the retuning, Ayato essentially throws away the entirety of his character. The character who was at the forefront of preserving and protecting those around him kind of just gives up and says, F it, I guess we will just give up and reset everything. Which, by the way, destroys everything he was trying to protect and all those he was trying to protect. Now, I understand that this is for the sake of a reset that makes everything, quote, better, but Ayato doesn't know that. In fact, he doesn't know any of this. So it seems like the series is actively promoting just giving up at this point. None of this is assisted by his inconsistent characterization, which, for some reason, the confident, growing young man for 19 episodes becomes a whimpering puddle of self-esteem issues near the end of the series for no real reason. But that's a topic for his own video. What I'm getting at here is that by setting up such a sharp dividing line between his motivations, i.e. the first 20 or so episodes, he has a motivation of, I'm going to protect everyone, to the very ending of the series where he says, I'm going to reset everything, inserts a very jarring sense of tonal dissonance or tonal whiplash as the guy who we're supposed to be rooting for, a very conventional reason, i.e. he's going to protect everyone and save the day, now is the guy saying that we need to reset everything, everything's screwed, screw it, whatever, I don't care. And this makes even less sense in context because his motivation is supposed to be to protect Haruka. Like, I know I don't like the Haruka-Ayato relationship thing, but if it is cemented in episode 22, it seems like that would be the ultimate thing to push him over the edge of saying, you know what, we're going to fight till the end, we got to keep this going, we don't need to retune the world, we can make it on our own, and prove humanity can persevere, or something along the vague positive anime motivations or messages like that. However, he seems to come to the exact opposite conclusion. He seems to think that now that there is something to actively protect, his motivations kind of disappear, which don't make sense to me because it seems like he'd be more motivated to preserve everything as it is. But instead he just kind of gives up and his motivations become the same as the antagonists, which just make his character look really weak unintentionally and just muddle everything even further. And as to be honest, his character is kind of assassinated at the end of the series, and I really don't like this. And it throws away all of his character development up to this point. Doesn't that also kind of make him an antagonist in some weird way? Or doesn't that make everyone wrong? Or does that make everyone right? It seems like the series wants us to say it makes everyone right. However, they're so poorly fleshed out and explained, and everything is just so contradictory to common sense at this point that it just makes everyone seem wrong. While I don't mind the concept of a reset ending, and I think that it's okay in this context, I have a problem with how they got to that conclusion, and how easily Ayato just flip-flops at this point. His character writing is very consistent up until about episode 22, and then in the last 2 hours they just throw everything away because they wanted to get to the reset, but logically couldn't work around his whole shtick of being the persevering opposition. They throw away his entire character to make the reset happen, and this incidentally makes his motivations line up with everyone else's motivations, which by the way aren't explained at all, so it just makes everything more confusing and morally ambiguous. If everyone shares the same goal, even for slightly different reasons, and we've established that some of those people are very bad, it makes everyone kind of bad. And it makes it harder for the viewer to relate or understand anything happening here, past the point that it's already been. And the fact that a simple chain of questions and logic can expose all of these plot holes really does do a lot of damage to the series, as it shows that it wasn't necessarily the most thought out or well executed. It does have a lot of writing holes, and while some people can try to dismiss this as complexity, it's not. It feels like either people didn't know what was happening, or purposely never even bothered trying to make up some kind of motivation in order to conceal motivations and make it seem more mysterious. The writers thought if it seems mysterious, no one will question it past the point, but if you continue to question it, it's pretty obvious that there really is nothing at a lot of levels, and it really shows how the show is an embodiment of style over substance, and this is one of its greatest flaws, as if writing, and especially motivations, are not clear, it's very difficult for a viewer to buy into a series fully, and style can only cover that so much. Also, I gotta ask, if the Foundation and the Mu share the goal of retuning the world, or at least some of the Mu do, and the Mu are also set up to be these horrible war criminals who conquer the world and kill indiscriminately, and thus are the antagonists, doesn't that also mean that the Foundation is kind of an antagonistic force? And, extending this train of thought further, if Ayato eventually ends up going along with the Foundation's plan of becoming the RahXephon and tuning the world, doesn't that mean that all three factions here have the same end goal, at least in practical application? And doesn't that mean they're all kind of working for the reset here? Which, doesn't that destroy the world? And isn't that bad? I mean, I know that the reset is done to set the world on a better trajectory, but they do literally destroy the world. So I guess you could say that they're either all three sides are bad, or all three sides are good. And both of those are kind of problematic because, well, I don't think a band of crazed war criminals or a shady guy manipulating everyone is good. However, at the same time, the ending of the series is portrayed as a positive one, which means it makes it seem like the right thing was done using the wrong methods, and it really just adds a lot of moral ambiguity to the ending of RahXephon, at least for me, because it makes me ask, do the ends justify the means? And was it worth it? I mean, I guess you could say yes, because I guess everyone turns out better in the new timeline than in the original timeline, but they still destroyed the world, and they still ended many lives in that process. Now, I understand that those actions are kind of undone, but you still did all of that, and if those actions are undone, how do people know about it? Do they know about it? I don't know. It's just really weird to me that all three factions end up kind of sharing the same goal, and there isn't really a lot of talk about any possible moral ambiguity here, and it just makes this even more confusing to me on a philosophical level. It seems like RahXephon wanted to defy conventional story structure by kind of not even having an antagonist, as again, if all three sides share the same goal and they end up using the same means, they're all kind of the same at the end of the day, which either means that the Mu are justified for committing all their crimes, or that Terra, a research group founded specifically to protect humanity, is in and of itself evil and a destroyer of humanity. This is actually a really interesting question that, of course, the show doesn't dwell on because the reset happens in literally like the last 2 minutes of the series, and it is one which makes the writing a bit muddy to me. As well, it does provoke some deep questions I'm assuming that the series would want to provoke. It also makes me feel like this story is more incoherent and just generally unstructured. Like, it feels like there were a lot of big ideas here, but no one really knew how to tie everything together, and thus it feels kind of weak. It feels kind of incoherent. It feels very unstructured, if you will. It feels like a blob. Like, I know what it is, and I think I can see what it's trying to do, but it's not structured enough to really do it very well, or at least in my opinion, and they went a little too far out of the box in this regard, as it makes for a story which goes from unconventional to a little indecipherable. Even when factoring in possible Mesoamerican inspirations for the plot of RahXephon, it still doesn't really make sense, because in the Aztec or Mayan or other Mesoamerican lore that may inspire parts of RahXephon's plot, there are reasons the previous worlds were destroyed, mostly depending upon either incompetence on the part of the gods or some kind of act of willing malevolence or negligence or something of that regard. It's usually something that makes sense in context, leading to the destruction of a world and the need to create a new one. However, in RahXephon's case, this doesn't work either, because it seems like all sides are dedicated to resetting the world, even though the only reason that they really need to reset it is because the world sucks, because of all the forces working to reset it. It's kind of a catch-22 at the end of the day, and a lot of the Mesoamerican lore that could have served as an inspiration for the series doesn't have that issue. RahXephon is just kind of a mess, and it's very evident when a simple question or series of questions like this can expose a lot of the writing or plot holes present. Getting to the ending of the series, while weak motivations may not seem to be the biggest issue a series can have, albeit a still serious one, I bring all of this up because of how it impacts the ending. I'm okay with resets, however, how they got here is very questionable. In spite of all of the bizarre symbolism and opaque storytelling present in RahXephon, I'm pretty sure the ending is supposed to be taken at face value as a literal tale of rebirth, i.e., everything is happy now because we've remade the world into a better version of it. I think it's supposed to be a commentary on the cyclical nature of the human experience, and for all of life's lows, there are just as many highs if we're willing to get through things and persevere and learn and grow. It's a literal reset, and therefore a literal embodiment of time recycling, and that's also in line with the Mesoamerican mythology, which may have inspired the series. All of this is fine with me. The issue, though, arises when we zoom out and look at how the motivations in the series got us to this point, and how especially they ignore and undo a lot of Ayato's character growth. Now, up until about episode 20, Ayato's growth has been quite solid, and he's had a lot of good episodes and moments where he's questioned who he is, and he's questioned his motivations, and yet somehow managed to get through things with the idea that I still gotta protect those I care about in the world I live in. We see this as he naively joins a quote-unquote good cause, and then navigates some identity questions that arise from this, and does some soul-searching along the way. He learns to accept himself though, and he learns to persevere, and he learns to think for himself, and he learns that life continues to move forward in spite of the circumstances around him. And that's how it is for about the first 21 episodes. As mentioned earlier, all of this kind of gets tossed into a dumpster, and for some reason he now all of a sudden says, "Oh, we gotta reset the world, F everything, it's all burning down, I'm gonna give up." And that's not a good moral. As he goes from actively trying his best to preserve the world and protect those around him, actively trying to ignore RahXephon's call to retune the world, actively trying to work within reality to do his best to make the world better, to just kind of giving up and saying, yeah, let's just make a new one. All these previous examples are good as they show a protagonist defying the odds and trying to heroically save the day in spite of them, inspiring the viewer to never give up and to realize the value of life and the need to continue through life's lows. However, since Ayato's motivations flip so radically in the last 3 to 4 episodes to essentially line up with the antagonists, and since we don't really know anyone's real motivations at this point, like we know what they want to do, but we don't really know why for sure, it all just seems to coagulate into some kind of nihilistic urge to retune, which can be seen as a sort of metaphor for giving up. RahXephon's ending seems to actively promote giving up. Now, this is an unfortunate subtext that arises from how poorly the writing of the motivations is done. Since Ayato's character flips so radically, it makes it seem like the show simply seems to promote the nihilistic urge that all 3 factions now seem to share. It makes it seem like the series now promotes that. It makes it seem like the series now supports the idea of throwing everything away and simply seeing what happens. It seems to now support the idea of giving up. And this is bad because it lends the ending a very uncomfortable subtext of suicidal idealization, something that you do not want to promote. It's subtle and it's unintentional, but I can see how the poor writing present can lead someone to come to this conclusion or interpretation of the ending. I can see how it leads someone to see that the series ending isn't a statement about rebirth, but simply just ending things. To support this statement, note that no one can actually confirm what the retuning actually does, or what it is, or how it works, or even if it hasn't even happened before. So everyone's essentially gambling with the fate of the world, not knowing if it's going to be a positive outcome. A very risky thing to do that at best is misguided and at worst is an active act of nihilistic destruction. All anyone does know is that the current existence will end. So, from what we can tell, no one actually knows if this is going to work, but they do know that it will destroy everything. A very not positive message. Ayato goes through with this anyways, though, and the series rewards it for him. And by doing this, and by completely throwing away his previous character growth and simply replacing it with the other faction's motivations, RahXephon seems to unintentionally promote a very dark subtext and the idea of simply giving up. I'm not talking about simply cutting one's losses and moving on to the next task at hand. I mean just ending it, if you know what I mean. And this is a very tragic message. And this is a very uncomfortable subtext that was unintentionally baked into the ending by how poorly the motivations are set up and explained. What is supposed to be a happy message of rebirth after tragedy is tainted by the possible interpretation of just give up and destroy everything, who cares anymore? And I really don't like that. Now, I'm 99% sure all of this is unintentional and simply the result of poor planning and execution, but it is there, and I want to point this out to further show why the failure to set up and explain motivations really cripples RahXephon.